few years ago, actually many years ago, in dog years, a world-famous credit card company had an advertising campaign that consisted of famous people coming on screen and saying the phrase, "Do you know me?" The premise being that we were supposed to recognize them by their face alone because they were so famous, and thereby, because they were so famous, the credit card they were endorsing should be one we would like to purchase and use also. With that in mind, I would like to ask the question as I zoom in here. Do you know me? Do you know who I am? Can you put a name to my face? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most Americans, or anyone actually watching this little video, are going to be able to say that that, in fact, was George Washington, the first president of the United States. Given the fact that he is so famous, that he is recognizable by his face alone, let me ask the following question. Can you quote something George Washington is famous for saying? Stumper, hey, Jeopardy question, $2,000 daily double question. No answer? Well, let me ask you another question. In your entire life, have you ever heard a Democrat or Republican candidate for, let's say, President of the United States, ever quote George Washington in one of their campaign speeches, or any politician for that matter? Isn't it a bit odd that the very first president of our country, who is so famous that we can recognize him by his face alone, does not have a single quote as part of our political landscape? Is that because President Washington was so mundane and boring that none of his quotes deserve to be preserved in history? No, it does not. This is a man who was at ground zero for the formation of this country. First, leading the army to victory, and secondly, guiding the country through its first presidency to a degree of success and popularity so great that the public did not want him to resign as president. They wanted him to stay on forever. But after a few terms, President Washington was wise enough to know that given the context under which this new government was created, it would be unwise for someone to remain in power longer than a few terms. So in 1796, President Washington prepared a farewell address to the United States of America. It covered a few subjects. One was his grateful acknowledgement for the appreciation the country had shown him in their desire to keep him on as president. But he also addressed the issue of feeling it was necessary personally for him to return to private life. And he also addressed the issue that it was necessary for the government to survive in a healthy situation to change leadership on a regular basis. He also addressed in his farewell speech the guidelines under which America should act and react with its neighboring countries around the world in order to prosper. And he addressed the subject of how the Constitution should never be messed with, even though the temptation would rise its head occasionally. And he urged that we have the patience to see if these urges were temporary before we acted with something as harsh as modifying the Constitution. But those are not the reason why neither Republicans or Democrats never quote President Washington in their speeches. 3/4 of the way through his farewell speech, President Washington expounds on the negative value to the United States of America that political parties have. And he warns that if political parties are allowed or were allowed to control the government of the United States, eventually it would result in the internal destruction of the United States. That's right, neither Republicans or Democrats can quote the great General Washington when they campaign on the trail, because General Washington did not like the idea of Democrats or Republicans. His philosophy was the best person suited for the office should run against someone else who thought they were the best person suited for the office, with no political party attached whatsoever. Now, this is written in 1796, so some of the language is flowery, I guess, by today's standards. But let me read you just one paragraph of how the general summed up his opinion of political parties. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated and the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism, like, a undesirable form of rule. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purpose of his own evaluation on the ruins of public liberty. Now, General Washington came from the background in England that led the American citizens to revolt and form a government that was the opposite of the government they were rebelling against in England. So General Washington is not talking about other forms of American government. He's just talking about negative government, period. The man had lived through situations wherein it was made perfectly clear to him that if political parties become the focus of our political world, the end is near, my dear, because we will have to fear that they don't care about you and me, you see. All they care about is using the term liberty to secure their own security and future and power and money. And liberty be damned. And that's today's new thought on an old idea from 1796.